Hello, everybody. I think we have a full house. Thank you all for coming. I'm Sherry Lair. I'm with Oregon State Parks. We invited folks from California, Washington, and Oregon, and folks from California had no budget to come, but we did get some folks from Washington at the last minute show up. Everyone else is from all over Oregon. We have folks from all different agencies. Quite a diverse group here. I'm pretty excited about this showing. I think everyone can see we're jammed in here, and I think having this nice round facility has brought some real energy together. There's no way you can't talk to one another. There's no way you can't interact. There's no way you can't feel this energy pulsing through the room, getting us all pumped about gorse. So there's folks here who are landowners concerned about gorse. We have the Department of Ag, the Department of Forestry. We have local, city, state governments, watershed councils, U.S. Forest Service, BLM. We have universities, private agencies. Abandoned Dunes is here. Anybody else I didn't mention? Any other folks I didn't represent? Citizen scientists. Citizen scientists. I think there's some master gardeners here. Yeah, right here. And the folks from Washington, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I think I said that. And there's the folks from Washington are from the Pacific County Conservation District. Got that right? Back here. So thank you all for coming. Our plan today is to have some presentations by some excellent speakers. I appreciate you all coming today. We'll go over that. You have your agendas in hand. For housekeeping, just a couple things. I think you've all noticed the restrooms are just around outside the door. Help yourself anytime you need it. Phones are off, right? What I'm planning to do today is have our speakers kind of go over an overview of our dual systems, our gorse on the ground, potentials for where we can go with gorse, and then I want us as a group to really start thinking about gorse, what the potentials are for us, for agencies, for landowners, for us as individuals, and where can we go? Where are the possibilities? So as we're watching these PowerPoints, as we're sitting here thinking, as we're running through our consciousness, as we're thinking about our own lands, as we're thinking about our neighbors' lands, where do we want to go? That's our job as we're passively sitting here, and then we're going to get together and just start talking. Then we're going to go out in the field, and we're going to, Abandoned Dunes has generously offered to shuttle us over to their site, which is just up the road, 3 minutes, and we're going to look at some work that they've been doing, and then from there we're going to walk over to Bullard's Beach State Park forest removal site and see a 10-acre site that State Parks is working on. And then we'll reconvene back here, back to all our cars, and if we have a few minutes to kind of regroup. That's our day. Any questions? All right. Now to start out, we're going to have Bronwyn introduce the Pacific Northwest Invasive Plants Council, which is the co-sponsor of this group, along with State Parks. And they have generously paid for this amazing coffee, pastries, lunch, and these pens, if you haven't grabbed one, are fantastic. And so, Bronwyn, if you'll take it from here. Thank you.
So I'm standing in for Stephen Manning, who had to be, he had to leave town. he actually went out of the country unexpectedly. So, excuse me if I read from notes, because I have no idea what I'm doing. Can you get the Stevens PowerPoint? So, okay, my name is Bronwyn Scott, and I'm actually one of the presenters later. So, I'm on the form, but I'm Stephen Manning right now. All right, so this is, that's not the first one, the first one. Yeah. Okay, so this is the National Association of Exotic Pest Plant Control, that's what that stands for, and it's a coalition of state and regional exotic pest plant controls and invasive plant councils. Try saying that really fast 5 times. It represents professional and natural resource managers, scientists, and other people with interest in invasive plant management, which obviously we have a really nice group of people here who fit that category. It was formed in 1993 and in 1996 got its IRS exemption granted. Their mission statement is the mission of the Pacific Northwest Exotic Pest Plant Control is to protect Pacific Northwest landscapes from invasive non-indigenous plants by providing an open forum to share information and promote solutions. So that's why they're helping with this particular event. So that's their website. In case you don't know, you can go up there. They have lots of good information. And he wanted me to emphasize the first and last bullet points for this particular get-together. It's really small print, I'll read it. To facilitate communication and promote collection and exchange of information regarding all aspects of invasive plant status, control, and management. And then the last one says, to provide forums where interested parties may participate in and share in the meetings and benefits from the information generated and promulgate. I'm not going to promulgate. Okay. Yeah. So you got the idea, right? Encourage. So one of their, 3 of their council programs are the Early Detection Rapid Response, the EDRR, and this is to train citizen scientists to spot invasive plants so that we can get them when they first come in. A nursery certification program, which works with nurseries to they voluntarily agree not to sell invasive plants, and then the information exchange such as this, this get-together. And they're going to have up-and-coming workshops, and I checked on their website. These are not up yet, okay? But if you're interested, make sure to ask Stephen. 2 awesome places to visit, Bend, Oregon, and Leavenworth, Washington, 2 of my very favorite places to go. So now you have an excuse to get out there. And this is Stephen's contact information. And this is one of the portals to some of the resources for people who are interested in continuing to be involved in this sort of thing. So I'd ask for questions, but I probably wouldn't be able to answer any of them. So questions to Stephen.
Thank you.
Oh, and special thanks to Sherry Lair for organizing all this.
So now I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Dr. Sally Packer is a coastal ecologist at Oregon State University in Corvallis, where she has been a faculty member since 2004. As a community ecologist interested in natural and managed coastal dune and estuarian communities, Dr. Hacker's research explores the structure, function, and services of coastal communities under varying contexts of physical conditions. Her work has most recently focused on the invasion, modification, and restoration dynamics of coastal invasive grasses. And Sally plans to set the stage today by giving us an overview of the ecology of the Oregon dunes with emphasis on the effects of beach grass invasions.
Great.
Thank you.
So Sherry called me up, interested in
finding out what I knew about gorse. And all I could tell her was that I knew that it occurred in the dunes down here near Bandon, but beyond that, I don't know a lot about it. She still wanted me to come and talk to you a bit about coastal dunes, coastal dune ecology, and kind of the natural history and the history of what has happened to the dunes over the last 100 years, to hopefully set the context for potentially why we have an invasion and potentially some consequences of the other invaders that are important in dunes. So bear with me. Hopefully this will make sense at some point throughout the day, but I'm not going to talk particularly about gorse research per se. Let's see here. And I should mention that I have two collaborators with this work. Peter Ruggiero, who is at Oregon State University. He's a geomorphologist and looks at dune geomorphology. And Eric Seablum, who is at the University of Minnesota, but was once at Oregon State University. So where do our dunes occur here in the Pacific Northwest? Probably a lot of you know this, but in case you don't, we have pretty extensive dune habitat in the Pacific Northwest. Something like 45% of the Oregon coast has dune habitat or sandy beach back dunes. And in Washington, almost 30%. We may have a little problem with some of my slides here, but hopefully it won't be too big a deal. And as you know, we have one of the largest dune sheet in North America. We're actually sitting on it right now. It's something like 150 miles long and 2 miles deep, so it's pretty extensive dune sheet. And so we're lucky in that way. Usually we think about the Pacific Northwest and we think rocky shores, but actually we have a fair amount of sandy beach and dune habitat that's pretty important in terms of where people live and the resources that we have. So dunes have a number of really important functions and services. Obviously they provide really unique habitats for native plants, shorebirds, amphibians, rodents. They also have an interface nature. They're basically a buffer between the ocean, so for example ocean waves, sea level rise, and the land, so terrestrial flooding. So they're at this interface that's really critical and really coupled both land and ocean processes. They also act as groundwater recharge and barriers to saltwater intrusion, which can be really important in some parts of the world, maybe not so much here, because we don't necessarily use the groundwater that's produced or that is contained in the dunes. But in particular in Europe and South America, or South Africa, these groundwater resources are critical to the humans that live on the coast. So prior to 1900, all of our beaches in the Pacific Northwest, and actually along the entire Pacific coast, were very sparsely vegetated. There was basically, it was a very open, shifting sand environment, very little vegetation. There was one native grass, Alnus mollis, which of course we still have here today. But this grass was not really good at stabilizing the sand that was shifting and blowing into roads and towns and basically causing havoc to people who lived here. And so there was a push to plant dune grass on these beaches, and in the late 1800s, beach grass was planted in a number of places along the coast. By 1940, pretty much all of the coast from Mexico to Alaska was covered in beach grass. So it was a really terrific invader, and was helped along the way through planting regimes and so forth. Two species of invasive grasses were planted. One was the European beach grass in Aqua area, so that came from Europe. And then a second grass, the American beach grass, which is native to the East Coast and also the Great Lakes, Amophila breviligulata, was planted mostly up near the Columbia River and in Washington. How does this grass stabilize the sand? Well, essentially, seedling grows, sand hits that seedling, it starts to accumulate a mound of sand around the seedling. That stimulates the growth of these seedlings because they're very much dependent on sand deposition for their growth. And so there's a positive feedback where the more sand piles up, the more growth there is, and so forth, creating essentially these little hummocks or dunelets, which then eventually become what we call foredunes. And so here's a schematic of a foredune with Amophila here growing along the foredune and capturing sand and keeping that sand from traveling into the back dune. And essentially by creating this foredune, what happens is there's some unique habitats that become established, in particular wetlands behind the dune, because now the groundwater is exposed. And that stimulates growth of a number of plant species, which eventually can lead to forested land and great habitat for gorse. So there's my plug for gorse. And so through the stabilization, essentially the ecosystem is transformed in pretty dramatic ways. Here's an example, here's a photo of dunes just up the road a bit. And here's the foredune right here. Here's where the grasses occur, where they create the foredune. And you can see that behind all of that, there's essentially a forested wetland. And so these forested wetlands were not here 100 years ago. I have a similar photo, which unfortunately I wasn't able to scan last night to put on this presentation, but there's a similar photo and all this is just white. So, back in 1940, when those aerial photos were taken, this essentially was an open shifting habitat, and now it's a terrestrialized, forested ecosystem. So my question is, how do these foredunes, which are created by this dune grass, change these sandy ecosystems and the protection of people who actually live behind these? Because not only do we have this sort of habitat in national or in parks, state parks, and so forth, and BLM land, but there are also these similar kind of formations in towns, for example, Florence and other towns that are dependent on these foredunes that were created 100 years ago. So the little history of the grass invasion, as I said, prior to 1900, there was a native beach grass, Elamis mollis. It is not a very good stabilizer of sand, so we never had foredunes prior to when Amophila was introduced back in the early 1900s. By 1950, Amophila arenaria was present all along the entire coast. In 1935, the second beach grass species was planted near the Columbia River, Amophila breviligulata, and as you'll see, Amophila breviligulata is the dominant beach grass in most of Washington and parts of Oregon, whereas Amophila arenaria is the dominant and actually the only beach grass species down in this region. And that has some pretty significant consequences. How can you tell the difference between these two beach grasses? Well, if you were to look at them in the field, you would, and even if I look at them in the field, it's very, very hard to see that they're different from far away, from a distance of a few meters. And the real test to looking at or telling the difference between the grasses is looking at the ligules, which are these little tissues between the blade and the stem of the grass. Arenaria has a long ligule, usually it's about 1 centimeter long, it can be even longer than that. Whereas breviligulata, Amophila breviligulata, which is our native to the East Coast, has a brevi, or very small, little ligule. And so this is a way that you can tell the difference between Arenaria, Ammophila arenaria, and Ammophila breviligulata. Elamus mollis, our native, also essentially has almost no ligule present. Ammophila, or Elamus mollis is very, very different from Ammophila breviligulata in appearance. So usually you can tell the native right away. Its color is kind of a gray, blue, or yeah, gray, blue, green color, and it's a very robust plant. And here you can see we just did some measurements in the lab looking at plant height, stem weight, and leaf width for the 3 different species of grasses that occur in the dunes. And essentially you can see that in terms of plant height, they're all roughly the same, but Elamus mollis has heavier stems, and they have the width of the leaves are wider than the other 2 species. Ammophila breviligulata, though, you can see is a little bit more robust in terms of its stem weight than Arenaria. And that actually has pretty important consequences. So what's the consequences of having these foredunes? Well, obviously now we have increased coastal protection for people who live behind these dune habitats, and there are quite a few people that have houses behind these areas along the coast. So it's protection from waves, wind, possible tsunamis. This is the Fred Meyer in Florence. Here you can see the foredune is protecting that parking lot. Obviously it increases the land stabilization for development. It also increases the wetlands that are behind the foredune. So these deflation plain areas have increased in number quite a bit since the invasion. And obviously these are really important habitats for rare amphibians and other species. They're also terrific habitats for invasion. And so, as you know, these are the types of places where gorse and Scotch broom and other invaders that are a big problem hang out. Some of the unintended consequences, obviously now we have a system that is not a shifting sand system, it's sand starved in the back part of the habitat. And so this dynamic nature of the shifting sand and the plants and animals that are dependent on that kind of dynamic nature is now pretty much gone along the entire coast, except in places where there are restorations occurring. There's a decline of the number of native plants and animals, 6 federally listed endangered plants, and the federally listed snowy clover. And there's an increase in invasions of other species. So, you know, Scotch broom, gorse, and many other weedy species that are now living in these habitats, which I'm sure they could not have lived in prior to the grass and the foredune and the change in the ecosystem that's occurred. So in this system we have, it's a pretty dynamic system. You've got climate processes, you've got the grass invasion, and you have management, all kind of tightly coupled with one another. And this leads to variability not only in coastal vulnerability, so the protection that these things might provide for humans, but also variability in terms of conservation and management. So what I want to do is just briefly talk about the research that we've been doing, looking at the implications of these dune grass invasions, both in terms of the invasion and coastal protection, but also the implications for the community and for management. There are 2 basic factors that are driving this system. One is the beach grass, and the second is sand supply. And sand supply is a huge factor in determining the shape of the foredune and the kind of ecosystem that you would have behind that foredune. In terms of the beach grass distribution, we did surveys from up here in Washington down near Cape Blanco, so near here, of a number of sites we ran transects and looked at the distribution of the 3 species of grasses. And you can see that Ammophila arenaria, which is this white circle, is not very abundant in Washington and becomes very abundant at Cape Lookout, and then is the dominant all the way down into Oregon. Whereas Ammophila breviligulata, the one with the little ligules, is dominant all into Washington, and then switches its dominance and becomes essentially, it's not present, at least that we could find in Oregon, in southern Oregon, central to southern Oregon. There are a couple places where there are some restoration sites where grasses were planted in Florence, where we have actually found Ammophila breviligulata present. So it may be out there in some spotty distribution, but for the most part, it's not very dominant. And then here's the native, the Elymus mollis. And you can see that it's pretty much present at all the sites for the most part, but not very abundant. It's about 25% cover. In terms of sand supply, believe it or not, sand supply varies quite a bit along the coast. Obviously sand is just deposited or lost from beaches due to waves that are bringing them on shore. And you can actually measure what we call shoreline change rate, which is the meters per year. How much does the shoreline either retreat or extend out into the ocean over time? And that's what's measured here. This is the shoreline change rate, meters per year, along the entire coast at all these sites that I showed you earlier, from Washington down into Cape Blanco area. And you can see that in Washington, especially around Long Beach, there's massive changes in shoreline. There's what we call progration, really massive increases in land, beach habitat essentially in these areas, something like on the order of 8 meters per year. And then there are places where there's a lot of loss of sand as well. Probably the sand is just being transferred back and forth from these systems. Yep.
This is just for 1 year of dredging?
It's actually over a 40-year time period.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's on a per-year basis. Yeah, good question. And then you can see that there's actually a fair amount of progression along Long Beach. And then as you get to, here's Cape Lookout, and you get into Oregon, you can see that some of the sites have a bit of increase or decrease in shoreline change rate. So there's some erosion happening. For the most part, they're mostly erosive, so we're losing a little bit of sand every year on these beaches. So I'll talk about kind of the consequences of that in a minute. The other thing that we noticed is that when we went out to measure these 2 different grasses and did these transects, we found that the foredune height, so the height of the foredune, its width and its slope varied depending on which grass species occurred on the foredune. So if Ammophila breviligulata was present and dominant, the foredune height was about a little over 3 meters, whereas it doubled to a little over 6 meters if Ammophila breviligulata, or Ammophila arenaria, was present. So you can see that the width also varies pretty dramatically, as does the slope. So these Ammophila breviligulata foredunes are shorter by quite a bit, 3 meters, than the arenaria foredunes, which are taller. But as you might suspect, it's not so simple as that. This pattern is actually confounded with sand supply, because remember I told you that there's a lot of sand coming ashore in the breviligulata areas, whereas much less in the arenaria areas. And so that's borne out in these data. You can see that shoreline change rate isn't very great with arenaria, and it's much greater with breviligulata. So this suggests that sand supply could also be a factor in determining how tall the dunes are, irrespective of the grass that's grown on it. So we wanted to figure out what was the case, and what we found is that, in fact, if you plot shoreline change rate versus dune height, there's a pretty strong relationship. When you have very little shoreline change rate, either positive or negative or near 0, the dunes, no matter what grass is growing on it, tend to be taller. they are taller. So when you have little bits of sand coming into those beaches, or leaving those beaches, the dunes are much taller. When you have prograding beaches or beaches that have lots of sand being deposited on them, the foredunes tend to be much shorter, which makes sense. It's sort of like a conveyor belt where sand is coming in, it's getting deposited, and then more sand is getting in and it's getting deposited. And the foredunes are kind of working their way out, and they never really build a tall foredune. But if you look at the data in a little bit more detail, and you try to separate out the effects of the grass from the sand, what you find is that the grass does have an effect, and that in fact, Reveligulata generally builds shorter foredunes than Arenaria for a given shoreline change rate that is essentially similar. So Arenaria is a better foredune builder in terms of height, height of the dune compared to Reveligulata. And that fact is due to differences in the morphology of the two species, which I kind of talked about earlier. Arenaria has thinner stems and it has more vertical growth, so it's better able to capture sand than Reveligulata, which has more vertical growth and is less able to capture sand. And we've done a number of different experiments in wind tunnels to look at the sand capturability of these two different species and also the native, and find that on a per stem basis, Arenaria is a better stabilizer and capturer of sand than Reveligulata or the native. So what does all this mean? Well, we can look at the consequences of having two different grass species planted at a site, and ask the question, what are the consequences of dune height to coastal vulnerability? The people who live behind these dunes, do you want to live behind a dune that's built by a grass that may not be quite as high as another grass species? And so you can do modeling to look at this. And we've done this with Peter Ruggiero and other geomorphologists to look at what type of wave height would you need to overtop a particular dune height. And does the fact that Arenaria, or does the fact that Ammophila Reveligulata builds shorter dunes, does that matter in terms of coastal protection? And also, does it matter in terms of climate change, which, as you probably know, predicts higher wave heights and higher sea level and other consequences? So I won't go into any details about this model, but basically what we found is that when we ran these models under different climate scenarios, that Ammophila Reveligulata tripled the number of sites experiencing flooding. So the idea is that if Ammophila Reveligulata is planted on a foredune, the number of times that the flooding will increase by threefold in those areas. And that surprisingly, when we looked at sea level rise, we put sea level rise into our calculations, it had almost no effect on the overtopping of these dunes compared to the effect of the invasion state, so whether or not Reveligulata was present or Arenaria was present. So this sort of exercise basically tells us that if you were to plant Reveligulata, or if Reveligulata were to invade the southern coasts of Oregon, the dune heights would be reduced, and that could increase the chances that these dunes would be flooded and overtopped, and people in campgrounds like where we are today might experience something more dramatic than they would now. Okay, what are some of the implications for community structure and management of these grasses? If you measure the species of grasses that co-occur either with Ammophila arenaria or Ammophila Reveligulata, you can see that many more co-occur with arenaria than they do with Reveligulata. So again, Reveligulata seems to have kind of a negative effect on the community by decreasing plant diversity in this case. You can see though that the number of invasions, actually the proportion of invasions doesn't change between the two types of grasses. There's still a number of invasive species that are present on either kind of foredune. And obviously the grasses cause a decline of snowy plovers, which are currently federally listed. And so that has prompted the state parks and other parks to do restoration on these sites. And I'm sure you guys are all aware of this kind of restoration. Most of it involves bulldozing down the foredune to create habitat for the plover, get rid of the grass. And we've done surveys in these restoration sites to look at what happens in terms of the intensity of this bulldozing, both for the plovers and their population growth, but also for plants that live with plovers in these habitats. And what we found is that lower intensity of grass removal, so maybe not bulldozing every year, but bulldozing at a more moderate scale, doesn't affect the birds. The birds breed just as well with or without intensive bulldozing, but it can have positive effects on the native plants, which makes sense. If you don't bulldoze quite as much as you might want to, native plants will come back and be a part of the system. And so this helps us try to make decisions about how much kind of whole ecosystem restoration we want to do in the dunes and how much we want to just target particular species. The other thing that grass removal does, obviously, is lower the dune height. So it's going to create a trade-off between coastal protection, so people that are living behind the dune or recreating behind the dune, versus the conservation part. So there is a trade-off there. How significant it is isn't clear, and this is some of the research that we're interested in pursuing. What are some of the management implications? Well, we might consider restoration techniques that restore both the original function of the dunes, so overwashing of these dunes. If we don't care about coastal protection, we may want to try to provide restoration techniques where overwashing of the dunes could occur, saltwater could come in, maybe even deal with some of the invasive species problems that we're having in these back dune areas. And still create habitat for plovers and for plants that live there, native plants that are used to having salt water and living in this kind of dynamic environment. This, of course, would have to occur in places where humans aren't really abundant and present. So in summary, invasive beach grasses affect the structure, function, and ultimately the vulnerability that are provided by dunes. They create foredunes that have major implications in terms of ecosystems. They decrease native species, increase non-native species. Dune height is important in terms of overtopping by waves. If Breviligulata, this species that's really abundant up in Washington, if it were to, for some reason, invade the southern coast, coastal flooding would increase. And there's likely to be some kind of trade-off between ecosystem restoration, whole ecosystem restoration, and coastal vulnerability, and how humans can interact on that landscape. And that's it. There are a number of people who helped with the research, in particular Phoebe Zarnetsky, who was a grad student of mine, who's now at Yale University doing a fancy postdoc. And we had funding both from EPA and also from Oregon Sea Grant, and that's it. If you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to entertain them.
Yeah.
How well do the two, how do the two species of the non-native beach grasses compete with each other? What are really the odds of the, I can't say the word.
Good, great question. Yeah. So we've done experiments in bags, huge bags that are filled with sand, and we put actually all three species in there, and done competition experiments or species interaction experiments, and varied sand supply. So a big part of this is, one species might be better at competing under higher sand supply regimes or higher disturbance conditions, for example. But essentially what we find is that Ammophila breviligulata is the competitive dominant. And it doesn't really matter what the sand supply rate is. For the most part, it competes, and actually, the more sand that you put on the plants, the better, the stronger the interactions between the plants, and actually, the stronger the ability for breviligulata to outcompete Arenaria. Yeah. So it's, it's a plausible argument that if you planted breviligulata, it could spread and outcompete Arenaria. Yeah.
Have you thought about going back east where breviligulata occurs and importing natural enemies to try to reduce its abundance and dominance?
No, we haven't, there's no active removal of these grasses. Besides the restoration sites, there's no push to remove the grasses in any way. So we haven't explored that. I'm not sure if, that would be something that people would be interested in. I think the issue is that the grasses, are friends to many people who live on the coast, and they don't, actually, many people don't even realize that they're invasive, that they're not native. So I think, that's a question that is, I think it's a community-based kind of question. Do you want to have these foredunes or not? Yeah.
So with the Ammophila I can't say it.
Breviligulata.
Yeah, it has characteristics closer to the native grass, correct?
It does, yeah.
And so, if you were looking at some type of restoration with grasses, the native grass is not as abundant. It's appropriate to go ahead and do restoration with that and transplant that.
It is actually, because it really, it does not even, so it's kind of on the extreme end of, breviligulata is kind of in the middle in terms of its stem weight and things like that. Elamus mollis, which is the native, is really a robust grass. But the key to it is that it doesn't grow very densely in most areas, especially right on the front of the dune in these high impact, sandy, lots of wind areas. It just does not grow very well. You put it in the back dune and it probably would grow better and have higher densities of stems and so forth. And I have seen monocultures of the native where it's pretty dense and there's a lot of biomass there.
So a follow-up to that is if you were looking at restorations or you were looking at dynamic dune environments, you may want to put the European in more of the urban setting areas where we already have developed
Foredunes.
where we want the higher foredune and the higher protection type environment. But go ahead and move toward either the native, West Coast native, or the East Coast grass in the more open, non-developed areas to try to create a more dynamic dunal area. And
Yeah, I think planting the native grass, the effects of that, for example, if you went in and you bulldozed the dune down and you planted native grass, I'm not sure what would happen. So I'm not sure I could answer that question, but it'd be a really interesting experiment to do. I don't know if the grass would just not grow very well, not really accumulate sand, because you don't want it to accumulate sand if you're trying to have some clover habitat or other things like that. So,
do we get into concerns then too with loss of those deflation plain wetland areas because of
so
targeted species in there that 100 years ago wouldn't have been using those as their native environment, but now they are?
Yeah. I think that's a really important question to ask. What's going to happen what's going to happen to these native wetland areas if we were to bulldoze down really large areas of foredune? And one of the things that we're kind of interested in doing is looking at that at a landscape scale, because that's kind of a landscape question. So I have a grad student here who's interested in potentially using GIS to look at, you know, what have been the changes over time when you do these restoration sites for plover. What happens to the back dune?
Well, you know, that carries on over to the gorse issue, the Scott's broom issue. If we pull those out
That's right.
and rip those out, then you're also going to affect that dynamic movement of sand into those deflation points.
Yep. 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 Yeah.
So I'm interested in the rate of spread of prevalent phenomena.
It's not spreading very fast.
5 years ago, I'm doing the math right, I went on a field trip with Al Wiedemann and Eric Seaton was on that trip too. We went down the coast in Washington and saw red religulata and then moved our way through the grass heights. And just that very fuzzy recollection of that trip matches pretty closely to the distribution shown on your maps today.
Right.
But I know Eric did more work on that in the 90s
Right.
and compared that to what you guys have done now. So, you know, is this something we need to be alarmed about, or does its distribution currently appear to be relatively stable?
Yeah, so I think it's red religulata spread north really well. So it's spread up Long Beach and that whole area. And I think it's in part because of the currents, the way the currents are traveling in the winter, carrying rhizomes and seeds and so forth. But then the other thing is there aren't a lot of headlands, you know, between those areas, whereas going south, there are tons of headlands. And they're what they call littoral cells, which are these areas where all the sand is contained oceanographically within a particular headland, between two headlands. So there are a lot more littoral cells as you go down the Oregon coast. So the ability for red religulata to disperse, I think, is really low. Like it's a pretty hard barrier to overcome. Otherwise, I think it would definitely would be down here in Southern Oregon by now, if it was easy for it to spread. The issue would be more like, what if we transferred it here? What if we accidentally planted it, not knowing that it wasn't Arenaria, but that it was this other species? I think that's the bigger concern is, you know, unintentional planting and restoring areas with grasses that you don't know exactly what species it is.
So one follow-up question.
Yeah.
Do you think that red religulata would actually cause foredunes to lower, or if it were to invade and establish foredune, would it just exist on that topography?
Great question. I actually think that it could lower them. And the reason is that we've looked at a 40-year data set of red religulata growing up the Washington coast, and we knew what the height was 40 years ago, and we know what it is now, and the height has decreased. So we don't know if that's because of sand supply or because of the grass, but it could be both. Yeah.
So, looking at your charts, if I was reading those correctly, confirmation is that the European beach grass has a tendency to have higher dunes and less washouts. And the East Coast beach grass, lower dunes but more washouts. So you get a lot more of that salty water into the ecosystem. But the European beach grass has more native plant growth with it. So if you're trying to protect native plants, native beach plants, you actually want the European beach grass versus the East Coast.
Potentially, yeah. Although the European grass has taller dunes, that might mean that the back dune is receiving even less sand, so that might cause problems in the back dune. That it's kind of unclear the trade-offs there. The other thing I should say is that even though the American species build shorter dunes, they're wider. And so there's evidence, for example, with overtopping, even if you have an overtopped dune, if you have a wider dune, you know, much longer area in which water has to travel, that can also be a pretty strong protective mechanism. So whereas with tall dunes, you can imagine them toppling over or being eroded. You know, if they were eroded at the toe of the dune, then they could just collapse, and then you'd have, so there are trade-offs in terms of which kind of dune you might want to have. Right? I mean, personally, I would rather have a tall dune if there's a tsunami coming. But that's just my own opinion. Yeah.
So to follow up on that, if I interpreted that chart that showed the relative number of native species with the two species, what did you account for latitude?
No, so there could definitely be, yeah, potentially. Although I should say that there are places where there's overlap of the two grasses, you know, and it's only at the Clatsop Plains area of Oregon. And there still is diversity differences, so, and it makes sense because Breviligulata is more robust, that it would have a more negative effect on the natives than the European one. Yeah.
So you're likely to have more spaces between
Yep.
the clumps?
Yep, yeah, and the clumps, like Arenaria tends to grow in clumps, whereas Breviligulata tends to grow like a grass, more spread out with rhizomes and, you know, that sort of growth form, whereas the clumpy growth form, you could imagine would be better for natives, potentially, yeah. Great questions, you guys. You're really thinking about the mechanisms. It's great. All right.
Anything else? All right. Thank you, Sarah.